name is Alice Millard and I'm an archivist at West Sussex Record Office. So this evening I'm going to be looking at the parish registers of West Sussex held by us here at the Record Office, and I'm using them as a gateway into the lives of several historic residents of African and African Caribbean heritage. So whilst we explore the documented histories of these individuals, I'll be touching upon periods of history which are essential to reflect upon to understand the lives of those I've researched through the archives. But this is also where I want to point out the obvious that I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic, and I don't have an extensive understanding of the historic, socio-economic factors which would have made their mark on the lives of the following individuals. But as an archivist who spends a lot of my time promoting the access to and the use of historic documents, I do relish any opportunity to delve through the catalogues, seeking snippets of information. And so hopefully my talk will show you that when you look in the right archival places, you can make some remarkable discoveries. So before we get going, I do need to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, this talk is being recorded, but don't worry, it is just me that's being recorded, no one else, and nothing you put in the chat box will appear on the screen either. And that's because we want to upload it to YouTube at a later point. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so you'll feel free to add questions into the comment box for me, and I'll try and answer as many as I can at the end. Lastly, we will also be issuing a short poll just before the end, so throughout questions we'll leave that up for a few minutes. Your feedback is really greatly appreciated. We try to do our best with these, so anything like that would be really useful for us. But most importantly, I want to address the use of terminology in the following original documents that we'll be seeing. So some of the historic language is offensive and it is racist, and it's reflective of the prejudices and misunderstandings that were prevalent at the time about other ethnicities and cultures. So it might be distressing. I won't be repeating this language, but I have added further contextualization information about the terms where I can, and they'll be added onto the slides where they're appropriate. Also, given the importance of names in this presentation, I wanted to point out that the names of some of the following individuals were likely given to them by white enslavers, thereby stripping them of their culture, family connections, and their heritage. And it's also important to sort of point this out because some of the names might seem a bit jarring. So throughout this talk, I will also make references to locals who participated in the enslavement of people and absentee plantation owners who lived in West Sussex. This talk isn't about them, but their stories are often intertwined with the individuals in this presentation. So without further ado, I think we'll get stuck in. So to give you a bit of background as to why the idea for this talk arose, back in 2021, I began a survey of the parish registers of West Sussex for individuals of African Caribbean and South Asian heritage, or those of multiple heritages. Inspired as I was by the fascinating research in Black and British by David Olusoja and the database project by the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, which is a fantastic resource. As you'll see later, descriptions of these individuals' ethnicity are sometimes unclear and racialized, so they are to be taken with a pinch of salt. So over the last couple of years, I kept a table of these individuals that I found with information such as their name, their ages if known, the parish in which they had appeared in, and any other details such as notes regarding their ethnicity, birthplace, which were often given by the notating curate. I then researched as much of their lives as I could using archival records online, such as Ancestry, Find My Past, and the British Newspaper Archive, amongst others. I've since amassed quite a few fascinating and unique stories of these early Black residents of West Sussex, many of which I will be talking about this evening. Also to note that as part of the launch of West Sussex Record Office's new website, there is now a dedicated page where you can search the names yourself from home, and I put a little snip of that on the screen there. So I am conscious that not everyone is familiar with what a parish register is. So I thought I'd give you a brief overview before we get going into some of the stories. So parish registers are a record normally kept in a volume of baptisms, marriages and burials held in a specific parish. It was the job of the church curate or vicar to keep this volume up to date. They were formally introduced in 1538 under Henry VIII after the formation of the Church of England, and this followed an existing practice that happened in the Catholic Church. However, these registers weren't accurately or reliably kept up to date until 1597, when Henry's daughter Elizabeth I made it mandatory. For this reason, many of the registers that we hold begin after this period. So the registers always include certain information, such as the names of the parishioners, the date of the event, be it baptism, marriage, or burial. And they also sometimes include extra details, such as a parishioner's residency, their age, occupation, and as we'll see, comments about their cultural background. You will often find comments on those who the curate thought were outsiders to the parish, sometimes ambiguous, but sometimes pejorative. But it is these comments which have enabled this research into early Black history in the county. So, who was the earliest recorded Black resident of West Sussex? So here we have the burial register of Mary, whose surname, if she had one, sadly isn't recorded. Mary was buried in the parish of All Saints in Chichester in 1595, so just 2 years before Elizabeth I made the upkeep of the registers compulsory. Sadly, but not very surprisingly, given the very early date, we don't actually know anything more about Mary, unfortunately. But the way in which her ethnicity is described doesn't offer any clues, aside from the probability that she was born in an African country. But contrary to popular belief, throughout British historiography, Black Tudors and Elizabethans did exist. They were in Britain, and they do appear in written records. And I particularly recommend a book called Black Tudors by the historian Professor Miranda Kaufman, who has done some fantastic research into this period in history. So I do recommend that book. So moving on. So this is the entry of William Petra Maria, who was married to Mary Freeland in Arundel in 1686 during the very tumultuous Restoration period. So William and Mary lived under the rule of Charles II. William and Mary were both described as being of the parish of Angmering, and William described in quite a vague manner, which suggests that he was light-skinned or of mixed ethnicity, potentially from Northwest Africa, and perhaps with a connection to Spain or Portugal, given his surname. Consequently, I think that the implication is also that Mary, his wife, was a white woman, probably local to Sussex. In the Angmering parish register, there is a baptism of a baby boy called Peter, born to a Peter and Mary Maria in 1688. So whilst there's inconsistency with the husband's name, is it Peter or is it William? I do think this could be a muddling of it, and I think it seems likely that this is the same family and they are baptising their child quite shortly after their marriage. So it's sort of nice to see the family have moved back to Angmering. Sadly, I couldn't find anything more about the Maria family, but again, it's fairly early. I'd need to do a lot more extensive research into that to find them. So we're going to skip forward just a few years now to John Primero, who was baptised in the parish of St. Peter the Great in Chichester in 1691 during the reign of William of Orange and Mary II. Similarly, with William Petra Maria, we can glean some information from John's surname. In Spanish, primero means first, which doesn't give us very much, but the language does suggest that John may have been connected to a Spanish or Portuguese colony in the Caribbean. But unfortunately, despite quite a lot of researching, I've not been able to find anything more about John, sadly. Now, the unique name of this very young girl particularly caught my eye. She was called Safunsaba Maryland, and she was just 4 years old when she was buried in Boxgrove in November 1732, having been in the household of the Duke of Richmond at Goodwood. It was fashionable at the time for wealthy and aristocratic families to obtain waged and enslaved black servants. Children and adolescents were particularly common. It was thought that their presence would symbolise a family's wealth and status to their visitors, whilst also emphasising their whiteness at the expense of their black servants. The entry in the Boxgrove Parish Register is quite sparse, but it did have enough detail for me to discover a little of Safonsapa's life. Given her the unique name, it didn't take very much at all. A quick search on Ancestry and to find a baptism record. So Safonsapa's was baptised in the parish of Holborn in London in September 1732. And her baptism entry states that she was 4 years old and was from Maryland, which I have taken to mean the US state of Maryland. At the time, Maryland was well established as a plantation colony and had both a community of enslaved and free Africans, as well as indentured and free white Europeans. We don't know anything about Safonsapa's time in America, but it's likely she was born in Maryland, given her age. And then she made and survived the crossing to England, all whilst being a toddler, and that would have taken several weeks, and it was extremely dangerous. So then I thought about searching the Goodwood archive, which we hold here at the Record Office, and I did find two possible references to Safonspur in an account book. This account book notes that an apothecary bill was paid and a week's worth of milk was purchased for a black girl in October 1732. So given Safonspur died in November that year, I think it's possible that medicine and extra milk was bought to nurse her through an illness that sadly ultimately killed her. As an interesting side note, Safonspur was also the name of a famous 3rd century noblewoman from what is now known as Tunisia in North Africa. So I think it's possible that the name was kind of crudely ascribed to Safonspur because of her ethnicity. But furthermore, Goodwood House also has a painting by the Renaissance painter Safonspur Anguissola. That's a self-portrait on the screen there. So I do wonder if that she may have been named after her namesake, Safonspur Anguissola. So moving on, I did find two further entries in the Boxgrove Parish Register of members of the Dukes of Richmond's household. Charles Buff, seen in the top entry, was buried in Boxgrove in 1700. He is presumably a young black servant, but sadly they haven't given his age. The other entry for Timothy, again, no surname given for him, also appears in a burial entry from 1728, but his age is given at about 8 years old. I think the terminology in Timothy's entry strongly implies that he, similarly to Sir Fonsaba, had the status of that below that of a typical servant and was effectively in bondage to the Duke and his family, despite ownership of slaves being technically illegal in Britain at the time. So here we have Cato Cromwell, and I think he has another example of an unexpected name. Cato, presumably in some form of service to Lady Frankland, was baptised in Chichester in 1775, and he was buried in the same parish just a year later in 1776. I think it's probably possible that Cato wasn't in the best of health at the time of his baptism, given the short period between his baptism and burial. And the name Cato plays into what was then a common naming practice of giving Greco-Roman names to enslaved people. Lady Frankland, as mentioned in the entry, was actually Agnes Surridge, who was originally from America and was a tavern maid before she married Lord Charles Frankland of Boston. Lord Frankland was descendant from Oliver Cromwell, hence Cato's given surname. But this means that we can probably infer that Cato had lived in both America and in England, and again, made and survived that crossing across the Atlantic, if not twice and once. So we'll move now on to the parish of Trotton, which is a few miles west of Midhurst, where a young man called John Handy was baptised in 1786. In the register, the curate noted that John was the servant of William Cock. William Cock was the purser of HMS Formidable, which made him, for all intents and purposes, a sort of naval accountant, and he would have managed the ship's finances. Very satisfyingly, I managed to find John's burial record on Ancestry. He was buried in the Unitarian Dissenting Burial Grounds just off the High Street in Old Portsmouth. So John was 58 at the time of his death, which would make his birth year around 1776. But what is most fascinating and remarkable about John Handy's legacy through the archival records is that he left us an account in his own voice of his life. So in June 1817, Handy's account appeared in an edition of the Christian Reformer, a nonconformist periodical which contained articles on Christian life, the Bible, and reformist teachings. And remarkably, I just found a scan of this whilst Googling John's name in the Google Book search engine. So Handy begins with a brief outline of how he came to be in England. He says, quote, "I am a native of Africa, but in what part of it I was born I cannot tell, because I was brought away from thence very young. I was forced away from my parents, unknown to them, by some of my own countrymen, and sold to a French trader." The transatlantic slave trade exploited an existing domestic system of slavery in certain West African territories, such as Benin, which were often a result of warfare or conflict where members of a defeated kinship had been captured. European traders would arrive at the west coast and purchased enslaved people for labour on plantations in the West Indies. However, the forms of enslavement present within Africa at the time were complex and differed from country to country, and it didn't develop in the same mode as it did in the Americas and the Caribbean. So Handy goes on to say that I was put on board a ship with a great many more. I cried very much, and my companion seemed very much distressed. When at sea, we were taken by an English ship and carried to Barbados, where I was sold again to William Cock, purser of HMS Formidable, and was sent by him to his brother, Mr. John Cock, at Portsmouth. So Handy describes the traumatic process of changing hands, being passed from kinsman French trader to English trader, and then on to Barbados when he was sold to William Cock, only then to be brought back across the Atlantic to Portsmouth. John doesn't say how long this process took, but it could not have been much less than a year, if not more. So Handy continued to move around after this point, and he goes on to say that we lived 4 years at Trotton and then removed to a small country seat called Highdown in the parish of Rogate near Petersfield, where we lived for 20 years. I'll give you an idea of where Rogate is in relation to Trotton. Sort of sandwiched in between Petersfield and Midhurst, where presumably the Cock household could access shops and services, as well as being close to well-travelled highways between Portsmouth and London. So the article also talks about how Handy was baptised in the Church of England and eventually converted to Unitarianism after discovering a nonconformist congregation near Petersfield. John eventually left the household after William Cock and his wife died, and he went to live briefly with William's sister in London near Greenwich. After a short period in the city, John removed to Portsmouth. He married, and there he remained for several years until his death in 1834, aged 58. So this next entry from the parish registers of New Shoreham sparked off rather more lines of inquiry than I had previously encountered in my research journeys with these individuals. So here we have the baptism of John Henry Thomas on the 2nd of April 1794, John being the son of Marcus and Elizabeth Thomas. Now, as I wasn't able to find an awful lot about the Maria family that we saw a little bit earlier, I was hopeful that I'd find more on the Thomas family, as they were living about 100 years or so after the Marias. So, searching ancestry, I found a baptism entry in the St. Martin in the Fields Parish Register in Westminster for a 19-year-old Jamaican man called Marcus Richard Fitzroy Thomas, which took place on the 22nd of April 1787. Despite the additional middle names, I thought that the age of this Marcus in Westminster would fit with that of the Marcus in New Shoreham. You can see the, just as a side note, that that's the Church of St. Martin in the Field in Westminster on the screen there. But whilst looking at the baptism entry, I did notice that the entry above Marcus's was for the son of the 3rd Earl of Harrington, Fitzroy Henry Richard Stanhope. Both Marcus and Fitzroy were the only children baptised that day, and the similarity between both names struck me as more than just a coincidence. I found myself wondering if it were possible that Marcus was, in some form or another, attached to the Earl of Harrington's family. So the 3rd Earl of Harrington, Charles Stanhope, had been in Jamaica defending the island and the British plantations from the French during 1781 and 1782. Upon his arrival back in England, Charles posed for a portrait by the famed artist Sir Joshua Reynolds. But this painting does include another figure, as you can see on the screen, that of a young black boy in military-style uniform, who at this point had not been named. It was seen as for many, many years, as a single figure portrait. So after a few weeks of further digging, I was able to establish that this boy was indeed Marcus Thomas, the father of John Henry Thomas, who appears in the New Shoreham Parish Register. I then contacted Yale University's Centre of British Art, where the painting is housed. Yale were able to confirm through Reynolds' studio diaries that someone called Marcus had indeed visited his studio the day after the 3rd Earl of Harrington had to sit for his portrait. Since discovering Marcus in this painting, I have also established through archives at the National Archives and at Westminster City Archives that he was a drummer in the Westminster Militia from 1793 to 1803, so throughout the French Revolutionary War period. But during this time, the Thomas family moved all around the country, also including to a military camp in Sunderland, where Marcus and Elizabeth Thomas very sadly buried John Henry Thomas just 3 years after John's baptism in New Shoreham. Now, it's perhaps a little hard to follow the story of finding a portrait of one of the people that you're researching, but I think the next two entries are particularly interesting. So here we have Charles Douglas Herring, who was actually the first individual that I did any extensive research into. So Charles was baptized on the 28th of October 1798 in in Rumbleswick, which is now known as Wick if you're local, in Chichester. Charles is also described as the black servant of a J.S. Douglas of Chichester. So Charles may have acted as in a role such as a footman. But as with many of the individuals in the parish registers, sometimes you get to know more about their lives through the connections to others who were often more affluent and more powerful. So J.S. Douglas was in fact James Sholto Douglas, the son of Charles Douglas of Funtington House. James was mayor of Chichester in 1810, and he generally held a lot of sway in local politics. He was also the consul general in Morocco between 1821 and 1829, which meant that he was the most senior representative of Britain in Morocco at the time. However, James was also the absentee owner of the grain sugar plantation in the parish of Hanover in Jamaica. So absentee meaning that he was not around to manage the estate himself in Jamaica, but rather he would have employed an overseer on the estate to do so on his behalf. So here is a map of Jamaica published by James Robertson in 1804, and it shows the grain sugar plantation as highlighted by the giant green hands. On this plantation would have been vast crops of sugarcane, which were harvested and processed by enslaved labour. So as a slight tangent, I thought I'd take a closer look into the process of producing sugar. So in 1823, the artist William Clark published a set of engravings that he had made of a sugar plantation in Antigua. They give us an idea of the layout and the setup of such a plantation, although with a caveat that these are heavily censored to give the impression of a serene manufacturing process, which covered up the reality. So in this print here on screen, we see a group of enslaved men and women who are cutting sugarcane. We can also see the overseers on horseback, and the overseers were usually white men employed to oversee the enslaved labour on the plantation, and often with brutal force. The sugarcane was then processed through a mill which squeezed out the liquid from the plant. The juice from crushed sugarcane was then boiled in a series of very large copper pots. But Clark's caption for this image describes what happens after that point. He says, quote, "The fire is stopped. The sugar is then ladled into a spout which conducts it to a cooler, where it is lightly agitated on its surface with a kind of spatula 3 or 4 times till the whole mass is crystallized. The wind which blows and enters at the windows cools the sugar and expels the steam through the apertures in the roof." Moving away from that tangent, I think this is probably a very good point at which to introduce to you a gentleman called Francis Forsyth. So like Charles Douglas Herring, Francis was also baptised in Rumbleswick, and he is noted as being around 16 years old and from Jamaica. Although the parish register doesn't offer further clues as to why Francis was in Rumbleswick at the time, knowing what I did of Charles, I thought it might be possible that Francis was also in service within the same household of James Sholto Douglas, despite the 12-year gap between Charles's and Francis's baptisms. So I decided to search for Francis on Ancestry to see if I could find a burial record for him. So whilst I didn't find a burial record, I did find an entry for Francis in the 1817 slave register, dated 5 years after his baptism in Chichester. So the recording of his name is slightly different, but as they're very phonetically similar, I believe it's the same person. The widespread use of a register of enslaved people was first used in Trinidad in 1812, and the practice gradually expanded to other colonies in the Caribbean. The registers were designed to monitor the lawful movement of enslaved people between islands after the transatlantic trade in slaves had been abolished in 1807. And that's not to be confused with the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. So in the 1817 register, Francis is described as mixed race, age 23, so that fits with his age given in his baptism entry, and the son of a woman called Daphne. Most importantly, however, is that Francis was included on the register returned for the grain sugar plantation, so the very same one that James Sholto Douglas owned. We can therefore infer that Francis was most likely taken from the plantation by Douglas to serve in his household in Chichester, only then to return to the plantation by 1817. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find out anything further about Francis after this point. So, a contemporary of Francis Forsyth was Joseph Walker, who also lived in Chichester around the same time. Joseph appears in the register for the parish of All Saints in Chichester on the occasion of his baptism in 1816, where he is described as the black servant of a Mrs. Dewar in North Street, Chichester. So no age, sadly, is given for Joseph, but he's vaguely described as being grown up, suggesting that he's potentially an adolescent. So I believe that Mrs. Dewar may have been Theodora Dewar, the Mrs. in that perhaps being more of a sign of respect for an older woman rather than marriage. So Theodora lived in North Street, and along with her fellow unmarried sister Elizabeth were members of the Dewar family, who were a prominent slave-owning, plantation-owning family who ran the Little Dewar and Big Dewar plantations on the island of Antigua. Across these two plantations, the family owned upwards of 350 enslaved people, varying in numbers over the years. After the abolition of slavery in Britain in 1833, the Slave Compensation Act was passed in 1837. This enabled former plantation owners and beneficiaries to claim compensation for the loss of their enslaved labour force. Theodora and Elizabeth were awarded as counterclaimants under a deed of settlement and as annuitants under their brother's will. And so the sisters would have received compensation money. But it's enough about them. I was able to trace Joseph in further records. So in the 1851 census, Joseph is living in Aldingbourne, which is a few miles east of Chichester. He is living with his wife Sarah, who was 21 years his senior. But most notably for me, his birthplace on the census is given as Antigua. I think we can assume then that there's a possibility Joseph was born into slavery on one of the Dewars' plantations in Antigua. But the circumstances which brought Joseph away from his birthplace and eventually away from enslavement and servitude, I'm not able to say. Sadly, Joseph died 2 years after the census was taken and was buried in Aldingbourne's churchyard. But it is clear that he spent his final years, hopefully, in peace with his wife, whom he supported by working as a labourer. You can see his burial entry on the screen there. So we are going to go back to New Shoreham now for our last entry from the parish registers for this evening. Here we have the very fun named George Diamond Yacoud, who was baptised in 1868, aged about 16. George's baptism entry states that he was born in Zanzibar, which is a collection of islands off the coast of Tanzania in East Africa. The entry also states that George was residing at St. Saviour's School in Shoreham. But George was in fact a Swahili man from Kilwa, which is a district in Tanzania. And the story of how he came to be in Shoreham is quite remarkable. So after finding his baptism entry, I began by searching Ancestry to see how easily I could trace George on other records. 2 promising records were returned in my search on Ancestry. Both of them were for naval service documents and both for George. One of them that you can see on the screen there. So these records show that George joined the crew of the HMS Wasp on the 3rd of December 1866 as an officer's servant, nearly 3 years before his baptism in Shoreham. So the Wasp was a sloop, which is a small type of warship, and it was commissioned by the British Navy to suppress the Indian Ocean slave trade, which was then prevalent along the Swahili coastline of Africa, but was primarily operating out of Zanzibar. And I found this photograph of 2 ships, and I believe the HMS Wasp is the ship on the right, but don't hold me to that. So when George boarded the Wasp in December 1866, it was being captained by Norman Bedingfield. Captain Bedingfield had recently published a letter in the newspapers back in Britain, which told of the vast number of small boats which were carrying people from Kilwa in Tanzania, people who Bedingfield said were being, quote, paraded so that we may see them. I think the implication here being that these people had been captured for the system of trading in enslaved people. As George's naval record showed that he was born in Kilwa and had joined the WASP at the same time that Captain Bedingfield was writing about his experiences of the Indian Ocean slave trade, I believe it's possible that George was one of the many people who Bedingfield reports being paraded around Zanzibar. But the mystery of George's short time at St. Saviour's prompted me to look into the records of the school. St. Saviour's became Ardingly College, which I'm sure you've heard of, in 1870, when it moved from Shoring to Ardingly near Haywards Heath. But originally it was located in Church Street, in the building that you can see on the screen. And the parish church is just off to the left. So I contacted the college archivist at Ardingly College, who was able to locate George in the admission registers. The details were given as follows, and you can see on the screen. Name given as George Diamond. Middle name is given as Yakud. Supposed age as 16. Entered by Lieutenant Reed of the HMS Excellent, stationed in Portsmouth. Joined July 1868 and left in August 1870. So was there for just under 2 years. I discovered that Lieutenant Reed had actually joined the WASP on the very same day as George, the 3rd of December 1866. He was also on board the Gladiator during the time that George was employed as a gunroom servant. So I think it's probably likely that George was a servant to Lieutenant Reed, who, for unknown reasons, had enrolled George in school for a period of time. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find anything more about George's later life, so I don't know if he married and where he died, which is a bit of a disappointment, but never say never. So George's was our last entry to explore in this talk. I really hope that you've found this kind of whistle-stop exploration of these lives interesting and perhaps and hopefully inspire you to carry out your own research. Ultimately, though, I hope that this goes towards challenging any old assumptions that the lives of marginalised communities in historic West Sussex will simply not be found, because they most certainly will, so long as you look in the correct archival places. So I've got a little slide here with some useful links. It's not very many, but they're all really fascinating resources. I'm going to leave that up for a little bit. And before we get stuck into questions, I'm going to ask my colleague at this point to release the poll. Thank you very much. Again, any of your feedback would be most appreciated. So I'm hoping that we have some questions. Oh, I don't think we do. Oh, yes, we have one here. Okay. Okay, so we have a question here. I visited a museum in Dominica that some of the British Caribbean surnames, such as Thomas, Joseph, Phillips, George, came from the names of saints rather than slave owners. I guess it might be half and half true, the other half coming from slave owners. I think from my experience, again, I don't know because I'm not a historian, but from what I've read and seen in my own experience, it's sort of a mixture where names come from. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of academic papers out there about naming practices, especially in different colonies. I don't know if anyone has any further questions. Oh, hi, how many people have you found? That's a really good question. I can't actually remember off the top of my head. I think it's hovering around 40, I would hazard to guess. We've got some more, so forgive me when I'm just reading through these. So someone's asking if I have ever seen any geographical trends or not in the records. Not quite sure what you mean by geographical trends. I don't know if you could clarify that maybe a little bit more, but I'd be happy to help answer that. Certainly, I'll come back to that. Someone's asking, will schools in West Sussex hear my talk? We're not affiliated with the school department very much. Not, but never say never. It would be great if schools address this a lot more, especially because it's local. Oh yes, thank you for clarifying about the geographical trends. So this question is about whether there were clusters in certain areas of West Sussex, i.e. more records in some towns. Yes, definitely. I think Chichester was a bit of a hotspot, but Chichester being historically the county town, it's not massively surprising. But there have been stories of individuals living in quite rural areas of the county, and that surprised me, and that probably challenged some of my assumptions. So yes and no, there are some clusters, but it's quite actually widespread. Yeah, I'm just reading through some more. Someone's asking if the inclusion of more is in some of their last names had any particular meaning. I'm not sure, to be honest. Again, I'm not an expert in this sort of area, but again, I'm sure that I think there's a lot online about naming practices at this time with enslaved people. And I think you should definitely check those out because there's people far more knowledgeable than me about this. Let's have a look. I'm just reading. Sorry, you're very enthusiastic and it's most appreciated. I'm just catching up with some of the questions. Someone's asking, have you come across any similar portraits to that of Marcus? They've seen one in Petworth. Yes, there's quite a few. I think on one of my slides, I added the name of a very good article that Art UK did about Black people in aristocratic portraiture. Check that out; it's really interesting. The proportion of named subjects, Black subjects in those portraits is very low. I believe sometimes a Black presence in an aristocratic portrait was sometimes there as a symbol. But yes, some people have been identified and named, such as Marcus, but there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. So have we got any more? Let's have a look. Someone is asking, is there a wider movement in English archives to join up the appearance of Black people in the records? Are other record offices conducting this kind of research? The answer is yes. There is definitely momentum across the country to do more of this. There are other record offices that have sort of pioneered this sort of work. I'm thinking mostly of, you can see the link on the page, the Switching the Lens project that the City of London, the Metropolitan Archives did, I believe at just after the millennium, actually. So it's got a good legacy, that project, and they surveyed their parish registers just like we have here. And again, you can search that in a similar fashion, that database for those individuals. I think. Bear with me, I'm still reading through some. I'll do my best to answer as many as possible, but let's have a look. Someone's asking, did I find any further Black women in Chichester? Yes, there are certainly more both Black men and women on my spreadsheet. I can't remember off the top of my head if any further people in Chichester specifically. I think there's also a lot of more wider research to be done outside of the parish registers. Parish registers is quite a narrow pool of records. I mean, they're excellent, they're fantastic, but it could be branched out at some point in the future. So almost certainly further names would come out of that kind of research. Okay, I think I apologize if I've missed your question. If I've missed your question and you would like me to address it, I think I've lost my way through all your comments, but if you would like to send a question in to me, please do. You can look up our email address on our website, wisroad.org.uk, and I'll be very happy to answer as much as I can or point you in the right direction. So I think at this point, this is probably a good point to wrap everything up. If you haven't already filled out the poll, if I could just ask you if it's possible. And just leaves me to say thank you very, very much for coming to this talk. If you would like to revisit it, hopefully the recording will be going up in the next week or two on our YouTube channel. So just have a look for us on there. Okay, so at this point, I think I'm going to stop recording and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much. Bye.